Welcome to the weekly Hamayan Parasha Shiur. The topic this week is Moshe's black wife. That might be surprising to you if you haven't heard about this incident or this individual. Who was this black wife? Who are we talking about? Now, in Moshe's life, if you ask someone who's learned some Torah, learnt some Chumash, and they're aware of the basic story, and you ask them, who was Moshe married to? So they'll tell you it was to Tzipora, and I have a daughter named Tzipora. It's a very lovely name. But in this week's Parsha, there's just a few verses which are a bit of an enigma. They're a bit cryptic, and they seem to discuss someone else. And let's look inside. I shared the text sheet with Hamayan's WhatsApp group. Perhaps we can share it on YouTube later as well. Now, the Parsha says, this is chapter 12, Perek Yud Beis, Psukim Aleph and Beis, verse 1 and 2, and I'll read it. The cryptic Psukim. Vatadaber Miriam va'Aaron. Miriam and Aaron, this was Moshe's older sister and brother, they spoke. B'Moshe, against Moshe, al oiros ha'ish ha'kushis asher lakach, about the Cushite woman who he had taken, ki ish ha'kushis lakach, because he had married a Cushite woman. Now, where is Cush? There is some level of debate, but according to most authorities, Cush more or less is the geographical area of modern-day Ethiopia. But either way, somewhere in Upper Africa, not right at the top, Northern Africa, but in the general northern region. Now, the next pasuk continues, and it says, what was their problem? They spoke against Moshe about the Cushite wife who he married. What was their problem with this Cushite woman? So, it doesn't say. It just says he took a Cushite woman. And then they continued with their words, with their sort of criticism. And they said, Vayomer, they said, Harak ach b'Moshe diber Hashem. Was it only to Moshe who Hashem spoke? Haloi gam bano diber. Did Hashem not speak to us as well? Vayishma Hashem, and Hashem heard what they were saying. And then the story continues that Hashem says, you shouldn't have spoken negatively about Moshe, and then they were punished, etc. Now, there's a lot of questions here. First of all, who is this woman? Number two, what was their problem with her? Why were they upset about this relationship? Number three, what are they adding in the second verse? They say, did only Moshe speak to Hashem? Is only Moshe a prophet? We too are prophets. What does prophecy have to do with this marriage? What does that come in? How does that come in? Now, before we get to all that, I'll just note something about the Hebrew language. How do we know that Miriam and Aaron spoke negatively? The first hint is actually in the first word of this chapter. It says vatadaber. Now, in English, there are many words. There are over 100 words, certainly, that relate to speaking. You could say, speak, proclaim, comments, notes. There's over 100 words in English that in some way relate to speaking. Scream, whisper, etc. In Hebrew there are several as well, not quite as many as English perhaps, but the two most common ones are Omer and Amira, saying, and Dibur, speech. What's the difference between them? One of the main differences is that when you use the word Omer, Vayomer, Amira, Leimer, it's more of a soft spoken words. It's more sort of calm, friendly. When you use the term Dibur, it's more formal or even perhaps more strict. And therefore that word already implies a criticism. Some commentaries add that the word Moshe, Miriam and Aaron spoke Moshe into Moshe, implies again that they were like drilling it into him. They were saying something negatively. Okay, so we see that in that section B. Where is it hinted that this was a critic? It's the word vatadaber, in front of him. And he continues and says, because what use would there be to speak not in front of him? That would just be malicious, it would just be negative. Obviously, they were speaking in front of him. That also explains the third verse. I didn't quote it here, but the next pasuk, pasuk Gimel, in this section says, and Moshe was the most humble person who ever lived. And the question again is, how does this relate to the story? He's being criticized about his wife, and then it says he's the most humble person ever. So the Arachaim says, if Moshe heard what they said, it makes sense to note, and he was the most humble person ever. Otherwise, he might have got up and said something, or he might have even started getting angry and maybe even physical. But no, he was humble and he didn't respond. So either way, according to the Arachaim, Moshe was present. On the other hand, I saw Chidush Eirim was the first Rebbe of Ger, which was the largest group of Hasidim in Poland. Since the war, they've been based in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel. So he said the judge and the coach or conduct when he was really head and shoulders beyond them. And by the way, that is something difficult for oldest siblings. I hope I don't fall under this category. I'm the oldest as well. But a younger sibling surpasses an older in a certain area, and then becomes head and shoulders beyond. And then can the older one recognize that actually right now he's the Rabbi, he's the tzaddik of the generation, he's the leader and he's way beyond us, or not? And that was their difficulty. They couldn't take in this idea that Moshe was just totally beyond them. But either way, we see that they had understood, and this is like many other Mefarshim, that Moshe was not present. Now, the main question perhaps is, who was this woman? And that is section D. Was this Tzipora or another woman? So now the words in the verse seem to imply that it's someone else, because it talks about a Cushite, which is from an African tribe, whereas Tzipora, the wife of Moshe we know about already, was from Midian. So she was from a different family altogether. Actually, it's interesting, I'll note, it's not directly related to the Shiur, but there are Midrashim that say that Tzipora was actually adopted. That Tzipora and Batya, the princess Batya who saved Moshe, were actually biologically sisters. And then they both got adopted. One got taken and adopted by the royal family, became a princess. The other one by Yitro. Yitro also was a high-level advisor and a priest of the pagan idols, and they both got adopted in high places. But either way, that's not the sort of simple understanding. Who was this woman whom Miriam and Aaron were criticizing? So the Rashbam says this is the first text in part D, and I'll read it inside. He says, Hakushit shehi mimishpachat Cham. This wife was a Cushite, and which Cush, the tribe of Cush, are descendants of Cham. We know that Noach, had 3 sons, Shem, Cham, and Yafet. We are known as, if someone's anti-Semitic, means that they hate Jews, they're against Jews. Why? Because Jews come from Shem, from the Semitic people. Then there is Yafet. Traditionally, we've understand Shem to be Asia-based, Yafet European-based, and in other words, Southern Europe, Shem in the Middle East, and then moving on further into Asia, and Cham into that Moshe's wife was a Cushite. And he says, he continues with, I'll say the rest outside, that there are many lost years of Moshe's life. We know that when Moshe was young, he ran away from Egypt. Then he appears back as an 80-year-old man, and he says, let my people go. Where was he from his whole teenage years? According to some, he left Mitzrayim. He ran away when he was only 12 years old. But either way, he was certainly a young man. And then he disappears for many, many years. And within the story, we've got 60, 70 years available. What did he do during that time? So there's a tradition in some midrashim that he ended up in Kush, and eventually there was wars there, and he attained a level of prominence, or even became the leader there. And he according to some midrashim, he was actually in the land of Kush for 40 years and a leader there, and he married a queen. So in other words, that besides his wife Tzipora, he also had another wife who had been a queen, a princess, some sort of leader of Kush. And what it's telling us is that he brought her back with, and he's still married to her many years later as the leader of the Jewish people. Now, Rashbam says that this was a marriage. It was perhaps similar. We find leaders in the ancient times getting married for a number of reasons, not necessarily to do with love. There was sometimes for political reasons or for other needs in order to link together two tribes. There could have been many reasons. And by the way, incidentally, with Solomon's many wives, that was the idea. It was not his wife in the sense that we understand it today. It was about political alliances mostly, it seems, at a basic level. Of course, there are spiritual levels, etc. So this was not a real marriage, but officially they were married. Now, people were unaware that this was not a real marriage. They thought it was a real marriage, and that's where the mistake came, with Aaron and Miriam thinking he was really married, and therefore, as we'll see, they had some criticism of that marriage, whereas for Moshe, it wasn't a real marriage. They had actually never been together. So, according to Rashbam, this was actually an African woman who Moshe married. The Das HaKainim's full name is Das HaKainim Behaalotecha. It's written by the Tosafos, the great French scholars in the approximately 1200, and they also agree with this idea. The Rashbam was one of the founders, one of the leaders of the Talmudic scholars of that generation, of the early Tosafos in France. He was the grandson of Rashi, and the Das HaKainim too says that this was an actual Cushite. The Das HaKainim says, I'll read it inside, this is the top of the next page, Kushit Mamish, she was an actual Cushite. Shahaita Malka, she was a queen. Moshe Mashal Kush Arba Mishana. Moshe was king over this land of Kush for 40 years. And that's why Miriam and Aaron criticized him. They said, is Moshe the only prophet? Is it because Hashem spoke to him that Niskaya, he developed this excessive pride, perhaps? He did not want to marry a woman from the people he was leading, from the Jewish people, and therefore, perhaps in some sort of elitist way, he needed to marry someone else, someone from Cush, because he didn't want to marry into the sort of followers class, the plebs, if you will, of Bnei Yisrael. And they said, what about us? Hashem spoke to us as well. We are also prophets, but we still married into the regular people. We didn't develop this excessive pride. So why is he? Why can't he marry a regular person from our community and from our family and faith? Of course, he would have converted, but still. In other words, they understood it as he thought that no one from Bnei Yisrael could be suitable because he's beyond that and he had to go elsewhere. And they said, why? They were saying this about this queen. You had to find a queen in Cush. There was no one good enough in Bnei Yisrael. Because they wouldn't have criticized him for marrying Tzipora. Because when he married Tzipora, he was in a difficult situation and there was no one else to marry. Whereas here, his finding a queen from a faraway land, it does seem that he is avoiding his own people. And that could have hurt, and that could have felt elitist in some way. So the first two, Rashbam and Dasakanim, have said that this was an actual Cushite. Now we're going to move on to Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra gives a few interpretations, but his preferred interpretation is that this woman was Tzipora. We'll get to the criticisms later, more on the criticisms later, but this woman was Tzipora, and I'll read inside in a moment, but basically the Tzipora came from the Midianites. They were a tribe within the general Arab Ishmaelite group of people, and their custom was to live in tents, and they would live in very hot areas in tents, and therefore they developed dark skin, and therefore they were sometimes called Cushites. They weren't actually from the tribe of Cush, but they were called that because they looked similar. And therefore we're not talking about some other woman, we're talking about Tzipora, who maybe was called a Cushite because of her appearance, but not because that's actually who it was. Let's read it inside. The interpretation which seems right to me is that Tzipora was the Cushite. For Tzipora was a Midianite, who are of an Ishmaelite tribe. They live in tents, and because of the heat of the sun, their skin darkens. Tzipora was swarthy and appeared like a Cushite. That's from the Ibn Ezra, great Spanish commentator. Rashi says it again, this was not another Cushite woman, this was Tzipora. Why is she called a Tzipora? It's a way of saying beautiful. Cushite is a way of saying beautiful. In other words, like saying it's something very stark and clear. Just as when something's black, you can see clearly that it's black. It's not like a rainbow or different colors. It's very stark, clear, and obvious. Similarly, Tzipora was very obviously, clearly a wonderful person, beautiful both physically and spiritually. It's interesting, and Rashi adds this as well, that the Hebrew word for HaKushit is the same numerical value as Yifat Mara, of beautiful appearance. And Rashi adds as well that this is not just, we don't mean just physically, we mean in her behavior. So that's how the commentators continue, and Rashi continues later on. Okay. So according to Rashi, they're saying this is such a starkly, clearly good choice of a wife. So then what's the criticism? Well, the criticism is that now he has separated from her. They're not criticizing his marriage, they're criticizing him stepping away from that wonderful marriage. Okay. The Abarbanel says, too, that their criticism was, why are you separating from Tzipora? And he says, if the reason is because, different people are attracted to different, physically to different types of look, if it's that this look was foreign to you in some way and you weren't attracted, well, she was Cushite the whole time. It's not like she suddenly changed her look. That's how she always was. And therefore, that wouldn't be a reason to separate now. And if the reason is because you're a prophet, so what? We're prophets. There's no rule that a prophet can't be married. There's no idea that if someone